Picture this. It's 1347, and Sir Geoffrey of Wherevershire is standing in the great hall of a castle, wearing 60 pounds of steel armor, trying to convince a screaming 8-year-old noble brat to eat his vegetables instead of throwing them at the servants. This is not exactly the Hollywood version of knighthood you were expecting, is it? Think your job is tough? Try being a medieval knight for just one day, and you'll quickly realize that these armored warriors spent far more time wiping noses than they ever did charging into glorious battle. The truth about medieval knights is so ridiculous, so far removed from every movie you've ever seen, that you're going to question everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. Before we dive into this historical reality check that will completely destroy your romantic notions of chivalry, smash that like button if you think you could actually handle being a medieval knight, though I guarantee you'll change your mind by the end. Subscribe, because we're exploring history's most absurd realities every week. And trust me, you're going to want to hear these stories. I'm always curious about our global community, so drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now settle in, because we're about to discover why medieval knights were essentially the world's most overqualified, overpaid, and over-armored babysitters. The reality is that medieval knights spent the vast majority of their careers not fighting dragons or rescuing damsels, but managing the daily lives, education, and frankly, the basic survival of noble children who were often more dangerous to themselves than any enemy army. These weren't noble warriors on epic quests. They were essentially armed nannies trying to keep spoiled, violent, and frequently sociopathic little aristocrats from accidentally starting wars, poisoning themselves, or burning down the family castle. And the most hilarious part? They took this job incredibly seriously. They developed elaborate codes of conduct, complex training programs, and entire philosophical frameworks around what was essentially advanced childcare with swords. The Code of Chivalry wasn't about noble warfare. It was a comprehensive guide to managing difficult children with anger management issues and access to sharp objects. But let's start from the beginning and completely demolish everything you think you know about knights. Because once you understand what these guys actually did for a living, you'll never look at a suit of armor the same way again. Hollywood has been lying to you. Every single movie, every romantic novel, every fantasy game you've ever encountered has perpetuated the biggest historical con job in Western civilization. Knights were not noble warriors riding into battle for honor and glory. They were professional child wranglers, and their entire existence revolved around one simple, unglamorous job: keeping the offspring of rich people alive and reasonably civilized. Hollywood has been lying to you. Every single movie, every romantic novel, every fantasy game you've ever encountered has perpetuated the biggest historical con job in Western civilization. Knights were not noble warriors riding into battle for honor and glory. They were professional child wranglers, and their entire existence revolved around one simple, unglamorous job: keeping the offspring of rich people alive and reasonably civilized. Let's talk numbers, because the statistics are absolutely devastating to the romantic image. Historical records from England in the 14th century show that the average knight spent approximately 3 hours per week in any kind of military training or combat-related activity. 3 hours. That's less time than most people spend in traffic. Meanwhile, the same records show they spent an average of 40 to 50 hours per week directly supervising, educating, or managing the daily activities of noble children and teenagers. Think about that ratio. For every hour a knight spent learning to fight, he spent roughly 15 hours dealing with medieval brats. These were guys who could tell you exactly how to remove wine stains from expensive tapestries, who knew the precise diplomatic language needed to apologize to neighboring lords when their young charges insulted their daughters, and who could break up a food fight between future earls without anyone getting stabbed. But ask them about military strategy? Most of them had about as much real combat experience as your average camp counselor. The term chivalry itself has been completely misunderstood. Modern people think it means something noble and romantic, like holding doors for ladies and fighting for honor. Wrong. Chivalry was essentially a comprehensive behavior management system Designed to keep volatile, armed teenagers from destroying medieval society, it was less code of honor and more advanced conflict resolution for people with swords. Consider the famous concept of courtly love, which sounds romantic until you realize what it actually meant in practice. Knights weren't writing poetry because they were overcome with passion. They were writing poetry because some 16-year-old lord's son had developed an unhealthy obsession with his cousin, and someone needed to redirect that energy into something less likely to cause a family war. Courtly love was basically medieval relationship counseling, with knights serving as therapists, mediators, and occasionally restraining order enforcers. The whole damsel in distress narrative is even more absurd when you understand the reality. Knights weren't rescuing princesses from dragons. They were rescuing teenage noble girls from their own spectacularly poor decision-making. Sir Geoffrey, Lady Matilda has locked herself in the tower again because her father won't let her marry that traveling musician. Sir Geoffrey, Lady Eleanor has decided to prove her independence by refusing to eat anything but honey cakes. Sir Geoffrey, Lady Isabella has challenged the Duke's daughter to a duel because she said her horse was prettier. This was the actual reality of medieval rescue missions. Knights spending their days talking teenagers out of emotionally driven disasters that could destabilize entire regions. They weren't fighting monsters. They were preventing monsters from being created by wealthy, unsupervised adolescents with too much time and too much power. The economic records tell the real story. Medieval household accounts show that noble families paid their knights primarily for domestic services, education, and what we would now call childcare management. The occasional military campaign was almost like a vacation from their real job. Some knights actually complained in letters about being called away to war because it meant leaving their charges unsupervised, which often resulted in diplomatic disasters that took months to clean up. One particularly illuminating document from 1356 describes a knight named Sir Thomas returning from a 2-week military campaign to discover that the teenage sons of his lord had convinced the kitchen staff to help them build a catapult in the courtyard, which they had used to launch rotting vegetables at a visiting dignitary from France. The knight spent the next 6 months negotiating apologies and compensation to prevent what could have escalated into an international incident. His letter to a friend describes this as typical Tuesday behavior from his charges. The training that knights received reflects this reality perfectly. Yes, they learned to fight, but they spent far more time learning what we would now call social work skills. Medieval training manuals for knights include extensive sections on conflict mediation, educational psychology, and behavioral management. They learn to recognize the signs of various childhood illnesses, how to manage food allergies, and techniques for dealing with what we would now identify as learning disabilities or behavioral disorders. They also received what amounted to diplomatic training, because managing noble children meant constantly smoothing over the social disasters these kids created. A knight needed to know how to craft an apology letter, how to organize appropriate compensation for damaged property, and how to negotiate peace agreements between families whose children had gotten into fights. These skills were considered far more important than sword fighting because diplomatic failures could start wars, while being bad with a sword just meant you personally might die. The psychological toll on these knights was enormous and completely unacknowledged by history. Imagine dedicating your entire adult life to managing other people's children who had been raised with unlimited resources and virtually no consequences for their actions. These weren't normal kids dealing with normal childhood problems. These were future rulers who had been taught from birth that their desires and impulses were more important than other people's lives. Medieval letters between knights reveal a constant undercurrent of exhaustion and frustration. They write about feeling like glorified servants, about the impossibility of teaching responsibility to people who would never face real consequences for their actions, and about the moral complexity of serving families whose children regularly displayed what we would now recognize as sociopathic tendencies. But here's the really twisted part. Society praised them for it. Knights were held up as paragons of virtue and nobility, not because they were brave warriors, but because they were willing to dedicate their lives to a job that was essentially impossible. Managing medieval noble children required skills that bordered on supernatural, and the knights who succeeded at it were genuinely admired by their contemporaries, though for completely different reasons than we imagine today. The armor, the pageantry, the elaborate ceremonies. All of this was essentially society's way of making an incredibly difficult and thankless job seem prestigious enough that capable people would be willing to do it. Because without knights willing to manage noble children, medieval society would have collapsed within a generation. These kids needed constant supervision by people they couldn't simply have executed when they got annoyed. So the next time you see a movie about a noble knight riding off to battle, remember that in reality, he was probably much more worried about whether the 13-year-old lord's son had remembered to change his clothes that week, and whether anyone had thought to hide the good wine before the visiting dignitaries arrived. But if you think the general concept of knights as babysitters is ridiculous, wait until you hear about how they actually trained for this job. Because night school was essentially a 2-decade program in advanced childcare management, and it was every bit as absurd as you're imagining. The path to becoming a medieval knight began at age 7, and from day one, it was obvious that this wasn't military training. It was an elaborate apprenticeship in professional childcare. The whole system was designed around one simple premise: you can't effectively manage wealthy, difficult children unless you've spent years being managed yourself as a wealthy, difficult child. The page system, which is romanticized in every medieval story you've ever heard, was essentially a medieval boarding school where 7-year-olds learned to serve other people's bratty kids. Think about how insane this concept is. Take a child, send him away from his family, and train him to spend his entire adolescence catering to the whims of other children who happen to be born into slightly wealthier families. Pages weren't learning to be warriors. They were learning to be domestic servants with a specific specialty in child psychology. Their daily schedule would make a modern child development major jealous. Wake up at dawn to help dress the Lord's children, serve breakfast while managing the inevitable food fights, supervise morning lessons while preventing the students from stabbing each other with writing implements, organize outdoor activities that burned off energy without resulting in serious injuries, mediate disputes over toys, games, and social hierarchies. The training manuals that survive from this period are absolutely hilarious when you read them with modern eyes. They contain detailed instructions on topics like how to remove various stains from expensive clothing, diplomatic language for apologizing when your charge insults a visitor, and recognizing the warning signs that a child is about to do something that could start a war. One manual from the 13th century includes a section called Managing Young Lords with Excessive Energy, which is medieval code for dealing with hyperactive rich kids. The advice includes suggestions like organizing elaborate treasure hunts to tire them out, creating complex games that require cooperation instead of competition, and something called productive channeling of aggressive impulses, which basically meant teaching them to hit things that weren't people. But the really telling part of page training was what they called diplomatic education. Pages spent hours learning to craft apology letters because they knew that their future careers would involve constantly apologizing for their charge's behavior. They studied regional politics not for military purposes, but so they could understand which families their young lords absolutely could not insult without causing major diplomatic incidents. They also received extensive training in what we would now call crisis management. Pages learned to recognize the early warning signs of various types of disasters their charges might create, and more importantly, they learned how to contain the damage once disasters were already in progress. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. Pages regularly dealt with situations like finding their young lords attempting to declare war on neighboring territories over personal slights, or discovering them trying to elope with completely inappropriate romantic partners. The transition from page to squire around age 14 was essentially a promotion from assistant teacher to head counselor. Squires were given primary responsibility for managing specific noble children, usually boys close to their own age. If you think managing your teenage siblings was difficult, imagine being legally responsible for the behavior of someone else's teenager. especially when that teenager had been raised to believe that his personal desires were more important than international law. Squire training focused heavily on what the medieval documents politely call behavioral guidance, but what we would recognize as advanced conflict resolution and anger management. Squires learned techniques for de-escalating situations where armed teenagers were having emotional meltdowns. They studied the psychology of adolescent development, focusing specifically on the unique challenges presented by teenagers who had never been told no in any meaningful way. The martial arts training that Squires received was real, but it served a completely different purpose than you'd expect. Squires needed to be able to physically restrain their charges when necessary, and they needed to be skilled enough with weapons to serve as credible bodyguards. But the primary goal wasn't to create warriors. It was to create people who could keep violent, impulsive teenagers alive and reasonably under control. Medieval training manuals include detailed sections on non-harmful restraint techniques for managing aggressive adolescents. These documents read like modern guides for working with at-risk youth, except they were written for people dealing with at-risk youth who happen to own castles and have the legal authority to execute people who annoyed them. The psychological aspects of squire training were incredibly sophisticated. Squires learned to recognize different personality types and adjust their management techniques accordingly. They studied what we would now call behavioral psychology, learning to identify the underlying causes of problematic behavior and develop appropriate interventions. For example, squires were taught to distinguish between attention-seeking behavior, genuine emotional distress, and what the manuals delicately referred to as inherited character defects, which was medieval code for this kid might be a sociopath. Each category required completely different management strategies, and making the wrong choice could have consequences ranging from diplomatic disasters to actual murders. The educational component of squire training was equally focused on childcare skills. Squires learned to teach everything from basic literacy to complex political theory, but they also learned specialized skills like maintaining student attention during lessons when the student has the legal authority to have you executed if you're boring. Teaching noble children required a completely different skill set than teaching normal kids, because normal kids can be motivated by rewards and punishments that simply didn't. It worked on children who already had unlimited access to everything they could want, and who were functionally immune from most consequences for their behavior. Squires developed elaborate techniques for making education engaging and relevant to children whose primary interests often involved violence, luxury, and power. They learned to turn lessons in mathematics into games involving siege warfare, to teach history through stories that emphasized the consequences of poor decision-making, and to present moral philosophy in ways that appealed to teenagers who saw themselves as future rulers of the world. The most challenging part of squire training, according to surviving documents, was learning to balance the competing demands of educating noble children while keeping them happy enough that they wouldn't complain to their parents about their treatment. Squires who were too strict risked being dismissed or even punished, but squires who were too lenient often found themselves managing situations that spiraled completely out of control. Medieval letters between squires reveal that they spent enormous amounts of time discussing strategy and sharing techniques for managing particularly difficult charges. They developed informal networks for sharing information about which approaches worked with which types of personalities, and they created early warning systems to alert each other when their charges were planning activities that could affect multiple families. The transition from squire to full knight, usually around age 21, was essentially graduation from a specialized program in what we would now call therapeutic childcare management. New knights weren't celebrated for their military prowess. They were celebrated for having survived over a decade of intensive training in one of the most psychologically demanding professions in medieval society. But graduating from knight school was just the beginning, because once you became a full knight, you discovered that all that training had been preparation for a career that was essentially running a medieval daycare center, except all the children were armed, legally empowered, and had serious anger management issues. If you want to understand what medieval knights actually did for a living, Forget everything you've seen in movies and imagine instead that you're working at the world's most dysfunctional daycare center. Except the children are teenagers with swords, unlimited budgets, and the legal authority to execute people who annoy them. And you're responsible for keeping them entertained, educated, and alive, while making sure they don't accidentally start any wars before lunchtime. A typical day for a medieval knight began at dawn, not because of military discipline, but because noble children were early risers who required constant supervision from the moment they woke up. Left to their own devices, medieval teenagers with too much money and too much time could create international incidents before breakfast. 5 in the morning meant night alarm clock duty. You'd be responsible for waking up your charges, which sounds simple until you realize that you're dealing with people who stayed up until midnight drinking wine and plotting elaborate pranks on neighboring families. Medieval nobles didn't just wake up grumpy. They woke up armed, hungover, and looking for someone to blame for their discomfort. The morning routine involved helping dress kids who were old enough to dress themselves, but too important to be expected to do it. This wasn't about physical inability. It was about maintaining social hierarchy. A noble child who dressed himself might start to think he was responsible for other aspects of his own life, which could lead to dangerous concepts like personal accountability. But the real challenge was breakfast supervision. Medieval noble children had access to rich foods, unlimited alcohol, and absolutely no concept of appropriate portion control or social etiquette. Knights spent their mornings preventing food fights that could escalate into family feuds, mediating disputes over who got the best cuts of meat, and diplomatically stopping their charges from insulting visiting guests who were trying to eat in peace. Medieval household records describe breakfast incidents that sound like something out of a comedy sketch, except they often had serious political consequences. Knights regularly had to physically restrain teenagers from throwing food at important visitors, tackle young lords who decided to challenge each other to duels over seating arrangements, and negotiate truces between siblings who had declared war on each other over access to the honey cakes. One particularly detailed account from 1334 describes a knight spending an entire morning cleaning up after his charge decided to improve the breakfast by adding ingredients from the castle's medicinal stores. The teenage lord had apparently thought it would be funny to see what happened if everyone ate food that had been seasoned with various herbs and compounds used for treating livestock ailments. The knight spent the rest of the day managing a dining hall full of mildly poisoned nobles, while crafting apology letters to their families. After breakfast came what medieval documents politely call educational activities, but which were really elaborate schemes to keep bored, energetic teenagers occupied with something more constructive than declaring war on their neighbors. Knights developed increasingly creative approaches to education, because traditional classroom learning was almost impossible with students who could have their teachers executed if the lessons got boring. Mathematics lessons involved siege calculations and treasure counting. History lessons focused on cautionary tales about rulers who made poor decisions and lost their kingdoms. Language instruction was conducted through diplomatic correspondence, teaching students to write letters that could resolve conflicts instead of starting them. Every subject was tailored to keep the attention of students whose primary interests were violence, wealth, and power. But even educational activities required constant behavioral management. Medieval learning was a group activity, and putting multiple armed, competitive teenagers in the same room was a recipe for disaster. Knights spent enormous amounts of energy managing classroom dynamics, preventing students from settling academic disagreements with weapons, and finding ways to channel competitive energy into educational rather than destructive directions. Midday brought outdoor activities, which sounds pleasant, until you realize that outdoor activities for medieval noble children meant things like weapons training, hunting, and what they called martial games, but which were essentially organized violence with minimal safety precautions. Knights weren't teaching warfare. They were trying to create structured environments where teenagers could hit things and each other without causing permanent damage or diplomatic crises. The hunting expeditions that feature so prominently in medieval literature were actually elaborate safety management operations, Knights spent these outings preventing their charges from accidentally shooting each other, stopping them from hunting on other people's property without permission, and managing the complex social dynamics that developed when multiple teenage nobles with weapons were trying to prove their superiority to each other. Medieval hunting wasn't a leisure activity. It was a carefully choreographed exercise in risk management. Knights had to balance their charge's need for physical activity and excitement against the very real possibilities of serious injuries, property damage, and international incidents. A hunting trip that went wrong could easily result in dead teenagers, outraged neighboring lords, and the kind of political complications that could destabilize entire regions. Afternoon activities often involved what medieval documents call courtly training, which was essentially teaching teenagers how to interact with other people without causing diplomatic disasters. This included instruction in proper etiquette, appropriate conversation topics, and the complex social protocols that governed interactions between different noble families. But courtly training wasn't about teaching good manners. It was about preventing social disasters. Knights spent hours teaching their charges to recognize when they were about to say something that could be interpreted as an insult, how to apologize effectively when they inevitably did say something inappropriate, and how to navigate the incredibly complex web of family relationships, historical grievances, and political alliances that governed medieval noble society. Evening brought dinner, which was another elaborate behavioral management challenge. Medieval dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a social and political event where multiple families interacted in a setting that involved large quantities of alcohol, sharp implements, and people whose pride was more important to them than their personal safety. Knights spent dinner time preventing their charges from drinking too much, eating too little, or saying anything that could be interpreted as challenging or insulting by other diners. They mediated seating disputes, managed conversation topics, and provided real-time diplomatic coaching to help their charges navigate social interactions that could have serious political consequences. The evening entertainment that followed dinner was equally challenging to manage. Medieval nobles didn't just play games. They gambled on everything, often wagering things like land, political marriages, or military alliances on the outcomes of dice games or contests of skill. Knights found themselves constantly intervening to prevent their charges from accidentally gambling away family fortunes or committing to agreements that could destabilize regional politics. Bedtime was perhaps the most challenging part of the day because it involved managing teenagers who were stimulated by a day of violence, competition, and social drama, often under the influence of alcohol, and who had no concept of appropriate sleep schedules or bedtime behavior. Medieval noble children didn't just go to bed. They planned elaborate nighttime activities, snuck out to meet inappropriate romantic partners, and stayed up plotting pranks or revenge schemes against people who had annoyed them during the day. Knights often found themselves essentially working as overnight security guards, making regular rounds to ensure that their charges were actually in their rooms, intervening in late-night romantic adventures that could lead to unwanted pregnancies or family feuds, and managing the kind of adolescent emotional drama that could easily escalate into violence when the participants had access to weapons and legal immunity. The psychological toll of this daily routine was enormous. Knights were essentially working as full-time behavioral therapists for clients who had severe personality disorders, unlimited resources, and no motivation to change their behavior. They were responsible for managing people who had been taught from birth that their desires were more important than other people's lives, and who had never experienced meaningful consequences for their actions. Medieval letters between knights reveal constant exhaustion, frustration, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of burnout. They describe feeling like their lives were completely controlled by other people's children, like they were trapped in careers that were essential to society, but completely thankless and psychologically unsustainable. But if you think the daily routine was the worst part of being a medieval knight, wait until you hear about the uniform they had to wear while doing all of this childcare. Because trying to manage difficult teenagers is hard enough when you're wearing normal clothes, but doing it in 60 pounds of medieval armor was a special kind of torture that Hollywood has never adequately captured. Imagine trying to chase a runaway toddler through a crowded mall while wearing a full suit of medieval armor. Now imagine that the toddler is actually a 16-year-old with a sword, anger management issues, and the legal authority to have you executed if you tackle him too hard. Welcome to the daily reality of medieval night work attire. Medieval armor wasn't designed for childcare, and yet childcare was what knights spent most of their time doing. The result was a constant stream of situations so absurd that they sound like comedy sketches, except they were the actual day-to-day reality of some of the most respected members of medieval society. Let's start with the basic physics of the situation. A full suit of medieval armor weighed between 50 and 70 pounds, depending on the quality and style. That's like wearing a small person strapped to your body while trying to perform delicate tasks like preventing teenagers from stabbing each other during emotional arguments or crawling under furniture to retrieve weapons that had been hidden during tantrums. The mobility issues were insane. Medieval armor was designed for mounted combat, where you're sitting on a horse and basically just need to stay upright while hitting things with long weapons. It was not designed for activities like bending over to clean up spilled food, running upstairs to break up fights, or fitting through doorways while carrying struggling adolescents who were having emotional meltdowns. Historical records contain numerous accounts of knights getting stuck in doorways, falling down stairs, and requiring assistance to get back up after being knocked over by the children they were supposed to be supervising. One particularly detailed account from 1327 describes a knight who became wedged in a window while trying to retrieve a young lord who had climbed out onto the castle roof during a sulking episode. The bathroom situation was a nightmare that medieval chroniclers were too polite to describe in detail, but which becomes obvious when you think about the practical realities. Armor wasn't designed for quick removal, and children don't wait for convenient moments to have emergencies. Knights regularly found themselves in situations where they had to choose between helping their charges with urgent biological needs or spending 15 minutes removing armor, while children suffered or created disasters. Medieval household accounts include numerous entries for replacing or repairing armor that had been damaged during childcare activities. Knights regularly cracked breastplates while bending over to help children, tore articulated joints while reaching for things in awkward positions, and damaged helmets by hitting them on low-hanging architecture while trying to move quickly through spaces designed for people wearing normal clothes. The helmet situation was particularly ridiculous. Medieval helmets severely restricted vision and hearing, which are pretty important senses when you're trying to supervise people who are actively plotting mischief. Knights couldn't see approaching food fights, couldn't hear whispered plans for pranks or revenge schemes, and often couldn't tell which of their multiple charges was creating problems until the situation had already escalated beyond control. But knights couldn't just remove their helmets, because medieval social protocol required them to be fully armored during formal activities. The armor wasn't really protective equipment. It was a uniform that symbolized their professional status. Knights who appeared in public without full armor were seen as failing to take their responsibilities seriously, even when their responsibilities involved activities where the armor made them less effective at their jobs. The temperature regulation problems were brutal. Medieval armor was essentially a steel oven that trapped body heat while providing no ventilation. Knights regularly overheated while chasing active children through sun-soaked courtyards, or during the physical exertion required to break up fights between multiple armed teenagers. Medieval medical records describe heat exhaustion as one of the most common health problems among working knights. On the other hand, armor provided no insulation against cold, which was a serious problem during winter activities. Knights found themselves simultaneously wearing the heaviest possible clothing while getting no protection from cold weather. The metal conducted cold directly to their bodies, creating a situation where they were both overburdened and underdressed for the weather conditions they worked in. The social dynamics of wearing armor during childcare created constantly awkward situations. Medieval children were fascinated by armor and regularly wanted to examine it, play with it, or use it in their games. Knights found themselves constantly managing situations where their protective equipment became a toy or distraction that interfered with their ability to do their jobs effectively. Children would hide things inside armor joints, use armor pieces as props for elaborate games, and sometimes attempt to remove pieces of armor while knights were trying to work. One medieval account describes a knight discovering that his charges had been using his helmet as a chamber pot during a long banquet, apparently thinking it was hilarious that he would have to wear it afterward. The maintenance requirements of armor added an enormous burden to knights' already overwhelming schedules. Armor required daily cleaning, regular oiling, constant inspection for damage, and frequent repairs. Knights had to wake up early and stay up late maintaining equipment that was constantly being stressed by activities it wasn't designed for. But the worst part was that armor maintenance often had to be done while still supervising children who couldn't be left alone. Medieval accounts describe knights trying to oil chainmail while simultaneously mediating disputes between their charges, or attempting to hammer out dents in breastplates while keeping one eye on teenagers who were plotting elaborate pranks. The weapon storage issue created constant logistical problems. Knights carried swords, daggers, and sometimes additional weapons, but these weapons were dangerous to have around impulsive, emotional teenagers. Knights regularly found themselves in situations where they needed to quickly secure their weapons to prevent their charges from using them inappropriately, but armor made it difficult to quickly remove or store weapons. Medieval household rules often required knights to remain armed at all times, but also held them responsible for ensuring that their weapons didn't contribute to violence or accidents among the children they supervised. Knights developed elaborate techniques for carrying weapons in ways that kept them accessible for emergencies, but prevented children from grabbing them during tantrums or emotional outbursts. The armor also created serious problems during the travel that was a regular part of knight duties. Medieval nobles moved frequently between different properties, and these journeys involved managing children and teenagers during long, uncomfortable trips under conditions that were stressful and boring for everyone involved. Traveling in armor meant being trapped in uncomfortable, heavy equipment for days or weeks at a time, while simultaneously managing children who were cranky from the travel conditions and looking for entertainment. Medieval travel accounts describe knights struggling to maintain order in traveling parties while dealing with equipment that made it difficult to move quickly or comfortably. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of the armor situation was that it made knights appear more formidable and capable than they actually felt. The armor created expectations that knights were invincible, all-powerful figures who could handle any situation with ease and confidence. In reality, knights often felt overwhelmed, exhausted, and uncertain about how to handle the complex behavioral and emotional problems they faced every day. The armor created a disconnect between their public image and their private experience that made it difficult for them to acknowledge their struggles or seek help when they needed it. Medieval letters between knights reveal that many of them felt like frauds, presenting an image of strength and competence, while privately struggling with job responsibilities that were far more complex and emotionally demanding than anyone expected. The armor wasn't just a physical burden, it was a symbol of expectations that were often impossible to meet. But if you think wearing armor while doing childcare was ridiculous, wait until you hear about medieval tournaments, because these supposedly glorious displays of martial prowess were actually elaborate birthday parties for spoiled rich kids, and knights were, essentially, expensive entertainment, risking their lives for the amusement of people who saw them as slightly more valuable than circus animals. If you want to understand just how far removed medieval reality was from our romantic notions of knighthood, let's talk about tournaments. These supposedly glorious displays of martial prowess and chivalric values were actually elaborate medieval birthday parties where grown men in expensive costumes beat each other senseless for the entertainment of spoiled children and gossiping parents. Tournaments weren't military training exercises or tests of knightly valor. They were basically medieval Chuck E. Cheese, if Chuck E. Cheese involved significantly more blood and the possibility of accidental death. Knights were essentially paid performers in a medieval entertainment industry, risking permanent injury and death to amuse the children of wealthy families who saw them as slightly more valuable than circus animals. The economics of tournaments tell the real story. Medieval account books show that tournaments were funded by noble families as entertainment for special occasions. Coming of age ceremonies, betrothal announcements, religious holidays, and yes, literally birthday parties for important children. The knights weren't warriors testing their skills against worthy opponents. They were entertainment contractors, hired to provide a specific type of expensive, dangerous amusement. The audiences at tournaments weren't fellow warriors or military commanders evaluating combat techniques. They were families with children who treated tournaments like we treat sporting events or amusement parks. Medieval chroniclers described tournament crowds that included significant numbers of children and teenagers who cheered for their favorite knights, the same way modern kids cheer for their favorite athletes or entertainers. But the psychological dynamic was much more disturbing than modern sports entertainment. Medieval noble children weren't just watching tournaments. They were the primary audience that tournaments were designed to please. Knights performed dangerous stunts and risked serious injuries, primarily to entertain people who were young enough to find violence amusing without understanding its real consequences. Tournament rules and formats were designed around entertainment value rather than military practicality. The elaborate pageantry, the colorful costumes, the ritualized combat sequences. All of this was theater designed to keep children engaged and excited. Knights developed specialized tournament fighting techniques that looked impressive and dramatic, but had no practical military application. The most popular tournament events were the ones that provided the most visual spectacle and the highest chance of dramatic crashes, falls, and injuries. Medieval audiences particularly enjoyed events where knights were likely to be unhorsed, because apparently watching armored adults fall off horses at high speeds was considered hilarious entertainment for the whole family. The joust, which is the tournament event most people think they know about, was essentially a medieval demolition derby. Knights charged at each other with long poles while trying to knock each other off horses, not because this had any military value, but because children found it entertaining to watch expensive, heavily armored adults crash into each other. The safety precautions at tournaments were minimal, not because medieval people didn't understand the dangers, but because the dangers were part of the entertainment. Medieval audiences wanted to see real risk and real consequences, because simulated danger wouldn't have provided the same excitement. Knights were expected to accept serious injuries and even death as occupational hazards of their entertainment careers. Medieval medical records show that tournament injuries were frequent and severe. Knights regularly suffered broken bones, concussions, internal injuries, and permanent disabilities from tournament accidents. Some tournaments had mortality rates that would be considered unacceptable for any modern activity, but these risks were considered part of the job description for professional entertainers. The psychological pressure on tournament knights was enormous. They were performing for audiences that included both their employers and their employers' children, and their future employment often depended on providing entertaining performances regardless of the personal cost. Knights who were boring, overly cautious, or insufficiently dramatic often found themselves unemployed. But knights also couldn't be too successful or too dominant, because that would make tournaments predictable and boring. Tournament success required a delicate balance between demonstrating skill and providing enough uncertainty and drama to keep audiences engaged. Knights essentially had to choreograph their own defeats to maintain entertainment value. The training for tournaments was completely different from military training because tournament combat was designed to look impressive rather than be effective. Knights learned dramatic fighting techniques, elaborate showmanship skills, and specialized equipment handling that was optimized for spectacle rather than battlefield effectiveness. Tournament weapons were often specifically designed to create visual drama rather than inflict efficient damage. Lances were constructed to shatter spectacularly when they hit their targets, creating showers of splinters that looked impressive to audiences. Swords were designed to produce dramatic sparks when they struck armor. Even the horses were trained to perform in ways that enhanced the theatrical aspects of combat. The social dynamics at tournaments were incredibly awkward for the knights involved. They were performing for audiences that included the children they spent their daily lives managing. But during tournaments, those same children were watching them get hurt for entertainment. Knights found themselves in the psychologically complex position of being both authority figures and paid entertainers for the same people. Medieval accounts describe situations where knights were injured during tournaments and then had to return to their regular childcare duties while dealing with injuries sustained while entertaining their charges. Imagine trying to manage difficult teenagers while you're recovering from a concussion you got while performing for their amusement the previous weekend. The prize structure of tournaments reveals their true nature as entertainment events rather than military competitions. Winners received prizes that were valuable, but not necessarily practical: expensive decorative objects, ceremonial weapons, and social recognition that enhanced their value as entertainers but didn't improve their effectiveness as military professionals. The most successful tournament knights weren't necessarily the best fighters. They were the ones who provided the most entertaining performances while maintaining enough skill to avoid being killed or permanently disabled. Tournament success required showmanship skills that were completely irrelevant to actual military service, but essential for maintaining audience engagement. The family dynamics at tournaments were particularly revealing. Medieval chroniclers describe parents using tournaments as educational experiences for their children, pointing out techniques and strategies while explaining the social and political relationships between different knights and noble families. Children were encouraged to have favorite knights and to follow their careers like modern kids follow sports teams. But tournaments also served as informal job interviews, where noble families evaluated knights for potential employment. Knights weren't just performing for entertainment, they were demonstrating their willingness to risk their safety for the amusement of potential employers and their families. Tournament performance became a crucial factor in career advancement for professional child management specialists. The equipment costs for tournaments were enormous, and they came out of knights' personal budgets rather than being provided by employers. Knights had to invest in specialized tournament gear, maintain expensive horses, and travel to tournament locations, all for events that were primarily designed to entertain other people's children rather than advance their professional careers. Medieval account books show that many knights went into debt financing their tournament careers, essentially paying for the privilege of risking their lives to entertain wealthy families. The economics of tournament participation only made sense if you understood that knights were competing for employment in an industry where the primary job requirement was being willing to provide dangerous entertainment for difficult children. But if you think tournaments were the most absurd aspect of medieval knight careers, wait until you hear about the Crusades. Because these supposedly holy wars were actually the medieval equivalent of disastrous school field trips, where knights served as underpaid chaperones trying to manage homesick, entitled teenagers during history's most expensive and deadly camping expeditions. The Crusades represent the absolute pinnacle of medieval knights being asked to do jobs they were completely unqualified for while pretending it was a glorious military endeavor. These weren't holy wars led by seasoned military commanders. They were essentially disastrous field trips where knights served as overwhelmed chaperones, trying to manage thousands of homesick, entitled teenagers during camping expeditions that featured disease, starvation, and accidental death as regular activities. The historical reality of the Crusades is so far removed from every movie depiction you've ever seen that it's almost impossible to believe. The majority of Crusade participants weren't battle-hardened warriors seeking military glory. They were young noble men, many still, in their teens, who had been sent on what their families considered an extended educational experience that would teach them responsibility and maturity. Think about how insane this concept was. Medieval parents decided that the best way to handle their difficult teenage sons was to send them on international camping trips to foreign countries where they would face disease, extreme weather, food shortages, and hostile local populations. And the knights were supposed to keep these kids alive and reasonably well behaved, while also somehow accomplishing complex military and political objectives. The logistics of managing thousands of young nobles during international travel were absolutely nightmarish. These weren't modern teenagers with smartphones and credit cards. These were medieval rich kids who had never been away from home, never faced real hardship, and never been in situations where their family wealth and social status couldn't protect them from consequences. Medieval Crusade chronicles, when you read them carefully, reveal that knights spent far more time dealing with behavioral management issues than they ever did fighting enemies. The real challenges were things like preventing teenage crusaders from starting fights with each other over perceived insults, managing homesickness and emotional breakdowns among people who had never been away from their families, and preventing young nobles from abandoning the expedition when they realized that international travel in the Middle Ages was uncomfortable and dangerous. The supply management issues were a constant source of conflict that required diplomatic intervention from knights who were essentially serving as camp counselors. Medieval nobles were accustomed to rich foods, comfortable accommodations, and immediate satisfaction of their desires. Crusade conditions meant limited food supplies, primitive camping arrangements, and long periods of boredom interrupted by moments of extreme danger. Knights found themselves constantly mediating disputes over resource allocation, managing teenagers who refused to eat unfamiliar foods, and dealing with young nobles who expected to maintain their accustomed lifestyle standards even while traveling through foreign deserts. Medieval Crusade accounts describe situations that sound like the worst possible summer camp experiences, except with weapons and international political consequences. The cultural shock experienced by young crusaders created enormous behavioral management challenges. These were people who had never encountered non-European cultures, never dealt with different languages or customs, and never been in situations where their European noble status didn't automatically command respect and deference. Knights regularly found themselves explaining to outraged teenage crusaders that foreign populations weren't automatically obligated to treat them with the reverence they were accustomed to receiving at home. They had to manage culture clash situations where young nobles interpreted normal cultural differences as personal insults that demanded violent responses. The language barriers created constant communication problems that knights had to resolve. Most crusaders spoke only their regional European languages, and they expected everyone they encountered to understand and accommodate their linguistic limitations. Knights served as translators, cultural interpreters, and diplomatic mediators, trying to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into violent conflicts. The religious aspects of the Crusades created additional psychological challenges for knights, trying to manage young people who were experiencing their first encounters with religious and cultural diversity. Medieval European teenagers had been raised with very specific religious beliefs and cultural assumptions, and exposure to different religious practices often caused confusion, anger, and emotional distress that knights had to address. Knights found themselves serving as informal counselors and religious educators, helping young crusaders process experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the world. This required psychological and theological skills that weren't part of standard knight training, but which became essential for maintaining group cohesion during long, stressful expeditions. The medical challenges of the Crusades were particularly difficult for knights to manage, because they involved keeping young people healthy under conditions that were almost designed to cause illness. Medieval international travel meant exposure to unfamiliar diseases, contaminated water supplies, extreme weather conditions, and limited medical resources. Knights regularly dealt with situations where significant portions of their charges were ill, injured, or suffering from conditions that required medical attention that wasn't available. They had to make decisions about when to continue traveling with sick people, how to allocate limited medical supplies, and how to maintain morale among healthy participants who were watching their friends suffer and die. The psychological toll on young crusaders was enormous, and knights bore the responsibility for managing emotional breakdowns, homesickness, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of depression and anxiety among people who were far from home, facing constant stress, and dealing with experiences that were completely outside their previous life experience. Medieval letters from crusaders reveal constant emotional distress, complaints about conditions, and requests to return home. Knights found themselves writing diplomatic correspondence to families throughout Europe, explaining why their sons couldn't immediately return home and negotiating extensions of financial support for expeditions that were lasting much longer than anyone had anticipated. The financial management aspects of the Crusades created ongoing conflicts that knights had to resolve. Most crusaders had left home with limited financial resources, expecting expeditions to be shorter and less expensive than they actually were. As expeditions extended beyond their planned duration, participants ran out of money and began demanding financial support from other expedition members or from families back home. Knights served as informal accountants and financial advisors, helping young nobles manage their resources, negotiate loans from other participants, and organize group funding for necessary supplies and services. They also had to prevent financial disputes from escalating into violent conflicts between people who were supposed to be cooperating toward common goals. The military aspects of the Crusades, when they actually occurred, were often less challenging for knights than the daily management of expedition logistics and group dynamics. Combat situations were relatively brief and straightforward compared to the constant psychological and social challenges of managing large groups of stressed, homesick, and increasingly dysfunctional young people. Medieval military historians note that Crusade military failures were often caused more by internal conflicts and organizational problems than by enemy military superiority. Expeditions regularly collapsed because participants couldn't cooperate with each other, not because they were defeated by external enemies. The return journeys from Crusades were particularly difficult because they involved managing people who had been changed by experiences that were often traumatic and disillusioning. Young nobles who had left home expecting adventure and glory often returned suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, depression, and disillusionment with the religious and social institutions that had encouraged their participation. Knights found themselves serving as informal therapists and reintegration counselors, helping former crusaders readjust to normal life after experiences that had challenged their fundamental assumptions about the world, themselves, and their social roles. This counseling work often continued for years after expeditions ended. The letters that knights wrote to families of crusade participants revealed the psychological complexity of their roles as expedition chaperones. They had to balance honesty about the difficulties and dangers their charges had faced against the need to maintain family relationships and avoid creating panic among relatives who were already worried about their young family members. But if you think managing teenagers during international military expeditions was the worst part of knight careers, wait until you hear about what happened when they got back home. Because medieval castles weren't romantic fortresses, they were essentially residential facilities for managing wealthy people with serious psychological and behavioral problems. And knights were the residential staff trying to maintain order in what amounted to medieval frat houses with weapons and political power. If you want to understand what medieval castle life was actually like, forget every romantic movie you've ever seen, and imagine instead that you're working as a resident advisor in the world's worst college dormitory, except instead of dealing with drunk college students, you're managing wealthy young adults with weapons, unlimited alcohol access, legal immunity from most consequences, and severe personality disorders caused by childhoods where they never heard the word no. Medieval castles weren't romantic fortresses where noble families lived in harmony, while knights provided occasional military service. They were essentially residential treatment facilities for managing people who had been raised with unlimited resources and virtually no behavioral boundaries. And knights were the overwhelmed staff trying to maintain basic order while preventing residents from killing each other or starting international wars over trivial, personal disputes. The psychological dynamics of castle life were incredibly complex and constantly volatile. You had multiple young nobles, often from different families with historical grievances, living in close quarters under conditions that were simultaneously luxurious and stressful. These were people who had been taught from childhood that their personal desires were more important than other people's lives, and who had never learned normal conflict resolution skills because they had never faced real consequences for their behavior. Knights found themselves constantly mediating disputes that ranged from petty arguments over seating arrangements to serious conflicts that could escalate into family feuds with political and military consequences. Medieval castle records describe situations that sound like reality TV drama, except the participants had access to weapons and the legal authority to execute people who annoyed them. The alcohol management issues were a constant source of problems that required diplomatic intervention from knights who were essentially serving as substance abuse counselors. Medieval nobles drank heavily as a matter of course, but castle life meant that intoxicated people with serious personality problems were living in close quarters with other intoxicated people with serious personality problems. Knights regularly dealt with situations involving drunk young nobles who had decided to settle personal disputes through combat, who had made inappropriate advances toward other residents or visiting guests, or who had committed to agreements or challenges while intoxicated that could have serious political consequences when they sobered up. The romantic drama in medieval castles was particularly challenging for knights to manage because it involved mediating between people whose personal relationships could affect international politics. Young nobles didn't just have casual romantic conflicts. Their romantic decisions could determine military alliances, trade agreements, and succession rights for entire regions. Knights found themselves serving as informal relationship counselors, trying to help emotionally immature people navigate romantic situations where their personal feelings had to be balanced against complex political considerations. They mediated love triangles that could start wars, managed breakups that could affect international trade, and counseled people through romantic disappointments that could lead to political revenge schemes. The competition dynamics among castle residents created ongoing tensions that required constant management. Medieval nobles were raised to be competitive in every aspect of their lives, but castle life meant that people who were accustomed to being the most important person in their family or region were suddenly living with other people who had similar expectations of importance and deference. Knights regularly broke up fights between residents who were competing for social status, romantic attention, or simply the recognition that they were the most impressive person in any given situation. These weren't friendly competitions. They were serious conflicts between people who had never learned to lose gracefully or share attention with others. The visiting guest management was perhaps the most diplomatically challenging aspect of castle life. Medieval castles regularly hosted visitors from other noble families, and these visits were essentially diplomatic events where the behavior of resident young nobles could affect relationships between entire regions. Knights found themselves serving as diplomatic protocol officers, coaching residents on appropriate behavior toward specific guests, managing interactions between people whose families had historical conflicts, and preventing social disasters that could have serious political consequences. A rude comment during dinner or an inappropriate romantic advance toward a visitor could easily escalate into international incidents. The entertainment planning for castle life was a constant challenge that required enormous creativity and psychological insight. Medieval nobles had been raised with constant entertainment and stimulation, but castle life meant managing groups of bored, wealthy people who were looking for excitement in an environment where most forms of entertainment carried serious risks. Knights developed elaborate activities designed to keep residents engaged without creating opportunities for violence or political disasters. They organized tournaments that provided excitement without serious injuries, hunting expeditions that burned off energy without trespassing on neighboring territories, and social events that allowed residents to compete and show off without humiliating each other too seriously. The educational aspects of castle life were equally complex, because knights were expected to continue the intellectual and cultural development of young nobles who often had little interest in learning and no respect for their teachers. Medieval education for nobles wasn't optional. It was considered essential for their future political and military roles, but it had to be conducted with students who could have their instructors executed if they found the lessons boring. Knights learned to teach history through stories that emphasized the consequences of poor decision-making, to present mathematics through problems involving military strategy or resource management, and to conduct language lessons through diplomatic correspondence that had practical applications for students' future careers. The conflict resolution skills required for castle life were incredibly sophisticated, because knights were mediating between people who had never learned normal social skills, but who had enormous power to create problems when conflicts weren't resolved effectively. Medieval castle disputes couldn't be solved through normal disciplinary measures because the residents were essentially immune from most consequences for their behavior. Knights developed techniques for helping residents save face while backing down from confrontations, for finding compromises that allowed everyone to feel like they had won, and for redirecting aggressive energy into constructive rather than destructive activities. These skills required understanding psychology, politics, and diplomacy at levels that most modern conflict resolution professionals would find challenging. The staff management aspects of castle life created additional challenges, because knights were responsible for maintaining relationships between noble residents and the castle staff who served them. Medieval nobles often treated servants badly, but castle operations depended on maintaining functional relationships between residents and the people who provided essential services. Knights regularly found themselves mediating between residents who had abused or mistreated staff members and staff who were threatening to quit or retaliate. They had to balance the political reality that nobles couldn't be directly disciplined against the practical reality that castle operations would collapse if staff weren't treated with basic respect. The seasonal challenges of castle life created additional stress that knights had to manage. Medieval castles were uncomfortable during winter, when residents were confined to close quarters for months with limited activities and increasing psychological pressure. Summer brought different challenges, as residents became restless and sought outdoor activities that often carried risks of accidents or conflicts with neighboring territories. Knights found themselves serving as seasonal activity directors, developing different programs and management strategies for different times of year. They learned to recognize the warning signs of seasonal psychological problems and to develop interventions that helped residents cope with the natural stresses of medieval life. The letters that knights wrote to each other reveal the psychological toll of castle life management. They describe feeling trapped in careers that required them to be constantly available to manage other people's emotional and behavioral problems, while receiving little recognition or appreciation for the complexity and difficulty of their work. Medieval knights often expressed feelings of isolation and burnout, describing themselves as living in environments where they were surrounded by people, but had no genuine personal relationships, where they were respected for their professional skills, but not valued as individuals, and where their entire lives were dedicated to serving people who often treated them as expensive, replaceable servants. But if you think managing castle residents was psychologically challenging, wait until you hear about the romantic and marriage aspects of knight careers. Because courtly love wasn't about noble romantic ideals. It was about knights serving as professional matchmakers and relationship counselors for people whose romantic decisions could start wars, and whose idea of courtship involved elaborate schemes that often bordered on criminal behavior. When you hear about courtly love and medieval romance, you probably imagine something elegant and poetic involving knights writing sonnets and performing noble deeds for beautiful ladies. The reality was that knights spent most of their time serving as a combination of professional matchmakers, relationship counselors, and crisis intervention specialists for people whose romantic lives were disasters waiting to happen. Medieval noble romance wasn't about personal feelings or mutual attraction. It was about managing the intersection of adolescent hormones, political alliances, family, feuds, and economic negotiations among people who had never learned normal social skills and who had the power to start wars when their feelings got hurt. Knights found themselves in the psychologically complex position of helping young people navigate romantic relationships, where genuine emotional connection had to be balanced against considerations like military alliances, trade agreements, inheritance rights, and the prevention of family feuds that could destabilize entire regions. The practical aspects of medieval courtship required constant supervision from knights who were essentially serving as professional chaperones. Medieval noble young people couldn't be trusted to interact romantically without creating diplomatic disasters, accidental pregnancies, or inappropriate commitments that could have serious political consequences. Knights spent enormous amounts of time preventing romantic encounters that could cause problems, facilitating appropriate romantic encounters that served family interests, and managing the emotional drama that resulted when personal romantic desires conflicted with political necessities. The courtly love poetry that knights are famous for wasn't romantic expression. It was essentially therapeutic writing designed to help emotionally immature people process romantic feelings in ways that didn't lead to destructive behavior. Knights learned to write poetry not because they were overcome with romantic passion, but because structured emotional expression was a useful tool for managing people whose romantic impulses often led to violence or political disasters. Medieval courtship involved elaborate rituals and protocols that were designed to prevent the kinds of social disasters that occurred when wealthy, impulsive young people were allowed to pursue romantic relationships without supervision. Every aspect of noble courtship was choreographed to minimize risks while maximizing the chances of achieving appropriate political and economic outcomes. Knights served as courtship coordinators, organizing social events where appropriate romantic connections could develop, managing the complex etiquette that governed romantic interactions between different noble families, and intervening when courtship activities threatened to escalate into conflicts or inappropriate commitments. The psychology of medieval noble romance was incredibly dysfunctional because it involved people who had been raised to believe that their personal desires were more important than other people's welfare, but whose romantic decisions had consequences that affected entire communities and regions. Knights regularly dealt with situations where young nobles had developed romantic obsessions with completely inappropriate partners, people who were already married, people whose families were political enemies, or people whose social status made romantic relationships impossible without creating serious political problems. Medieval letters between knights reveal constant frustration with managing people whose romantic lives seemed designed to create maximum drama and political complexity. Knights describe feeling like they were constantly preventing romantic disasters while trying to facilitate appropriate romantic connections among people who seemed determined to make the worst possible romantic choices. The arranged marriage negotiations that were a central part of medieval noble life required sophisticated diplomatic skills from knights, who often served as intermediaries between families. These weren't simple business transactions. They were complex negotiations that had to balance emotional, political, and economic considerations while managing the feelings of young people who often had strong opinions about marriages they had little control over. Knights found themselves serving as marriage counselors before marriages even occurred, helping young people understand and accept romantic arrangements that had been made for political reasons. They had to balance honesty about the realities of arranged marriage against the need to help people develop functional romantic relationships within those arrangements. The wedding planning and ceremony management aspects of noble marriages created additional challenges for knights, who were often responsible for organizing events that were simultaneously romantic celebrations and political demonstrations. Medieval noble weddings weren't just personal ceremonies. They were diplomatic events where the behavior of all participants could affect relationships between families and regions. Knights served as wedding planners, security coordinators, and diplomatic protocol officers during marriage ceremonies that often involved hundreds of guests from multiple noble families with complex historical relationships. They had to prevent social disasters while ensuring that ceremonies proceeded in ways that enhanced rather than damaged political relationships. The post-marriage relationship management was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of knights' romantic counseling duties. Medieval arranged marriages often involved people who barely knew each other and who had to develop functional romantic relationships under enormous political and social pressure. Knights found themselves serving as ongoing marriage counselors, helping couples navigate romantic relationships that were simultaneously personal and political, where personal compatibility had to be balanced against family expectations and political necessities. The adultery management issues were a constant source of diplomatic crises that required intervention from knights, who were essentially serving as relationship crisis counselors. Medieval noble marriages were often emotionally unsatisfying but adultery could have serious political consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Knights regularly dealt with situations involving romantic affairs that threatened to create family feuds, political conflicts, or succession crises. They had to balance discretion and privacy concerns against the need to prevent romantic scandals from escalating into political disasters. The divorce and annulment negotiations that occasionally occurred in medieval noble marriages required knights to serve as legal advocates and diplomatic negotiators in situations that were simultaneously personal and political. Medieval marriage dissolution wasn't just about ending romantic relationships. It involved complex negotiations over property, political alliances, and family relationships that could affect multiple generations. Knights found themselves mediating between people whose romantic relationships had failed, but whose families still needed to maintain political and economic relationships. They had to find ways to dissolve romantic partnerships while preserving the broader family and political connections that those partnerships had been designed to create or strengthen. The psychological toll of managing other people's romantic lives was enormous for knights, who often sacrificed their own romantic relationships in service of managing the romantic disasters of their employers and their employers' children. Medieval knights often remained unmarried or married late in life, because their careers required constant availability for romantic crisis management. Knights describe feeling like their entire adult lives were spent managing other people's emotional problems, while having no time or energy for their own personal relationships. They were experts in romantic counseling and relationship management, but their expertise came at the cost of their own romantic fulfillment. The letters between knights reveal constant emotional exhaustion from managing people whose romantic lives were sources of ongoing drama and political complications. Knights describe feeling trapped in careers that required them to be constantly involved in other people's most intimate personal problems, while maintaining professional boundaries that prevented them from developing genuine personal connections. But if you think the romantic counseling was the most psychologically demanding aspect of knight careers, wait until you hear about the economics of the profession. Because being a knight wasn't just about managing difficult people. It was about being an expensive, specialized service provider in a market where your clients had the power to destroy your career or your life if they were dissatisfied with your performance. The financial reality of being a medieval knight reveals the most absurd aspect of the entire profession. These were essentially expensive, specialized nannies whose services were so essential to medieval society that noble families were willing to pay premium prices for armed childcare, even though the children being cared for had the legal authority to execute their caregivers if they got sufficiently annoyed. Medieval economic records show that knights were among the highest-paid service professionals in medieval society, but their compensation reflected the extraordinary hazard pay required for managing people whose behavioral problems could have international political consequences. Knight salaries weren't just payment for military service. They were compensation for psychological trauma, political liability, and constant personal danger from the people they were supposed to be helping. The cost comparison between medieval knights and modern childcare reveals just how expensive this service was. A single knight's annual compensation, when adjusted for medieval economic standards, was equivalent to the combined salaries of several modern teachers, counselors, and security professionals. Noble families paid these premium rates because knights provided services that literally couldn't be obtained anywhere else. Think about the job requirements from an economic perspective. Knights needed to be skilled warriors, but they also needed to be expert counselors, teachers, diplomats, crisis managers, and psychological therapists. They needed to be physically capable of restraining violent teenagers, but also psychologically sophisticated enough to provide effective behavioral therapy. They needed to be politically savvy enough to prevent international incidents, but also emotionally resilient enough to maintain professional relationships with people who treated them badly. The payment structure for knights reflected the complexity and difficulty of their actual job responsibilities. Knights weren't paid primarily for military service. They were paid for being willing to dedicate their entire adult lives to managing other people's children under conditions that were psychologically demanding and often personally dangerous. Medieval nobles paid knights in land, property, and ongoing financial support rather than simple wages. Because knight services required long-term commitment and ongoing availability, knights couldn't have normal personal lives or career flexibility, because their employers needed to know that qualified child management specialists would always be available for crisis situations. The land grants that knights received weren't rewards for military heroism. They were essentially employer-provided housing and financial security designed to ensure that knights could focus entirely on their childcare responsibilities without worrying about their own economic survival. Medieval nobles understood that effective child management required specialists who weren't distracted by personal financial concerns. But the most revealing aspect of knight economics was the insurance and liability considerations. Medieval knights needed financial protection against the possibility that their charges might decide to have them executed, or that they might accidentally injure or kill someone while trying to prevent a diplomatic disaster. Knight compensation included provisions for family support in case knights were killed or injured while performing their duties. Medieval economic records show that knights regularly purchased what amounted to life insurance and disability insurance, because their profession involved constant exposure to violence from people who were legally immune from most consequences for their behavior. Knights needed financial protection against the possibility that their clients might literally kill them if they were dissatisfied with the service they received. The equipment costs for knights were enormous and came entirely from their personal budgets, rather than being provided by employers. Knights had to purchase and maintain expensive armor, weapons, horses, and other equipment that was necessary for their professional image, but which served primarily ceremonial rather than practical purposes. Medieval account books show that knights often spent more on equipment maintenance than modern professionals spend on their cars, and the equipment had to be constantly replaced or repaired because it was being used for activities it wasn't designed for. Armor that was designed for mounted combat wasn't built to withstand the daily wear and tear of childcare activities. The travel expenses associated with knight careers were also significant, because knights regularly accompanied their charges on journeys that could last for months and that often involved international travel under dangerous and expensive conditions. Knights had to pay their own travel costs, while also ensuring that their charges were provided with appropriate accommodations and entertainment during long, stressful journeys. The professional development costs for knights were unlike any other medieval profession, because knights needed to constantly update their skills in areas ranging from combat techniques to psychological counseling to international diplomacy. Medieval knights invested heavily in ongoing education and training that kept them current with changing political situations and evolving child management techniques. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of knight economics was the complete lack of job security. Knights could be dismissed or even executed at any time if their employers were dissatisfied with their performance, regardless of the quality of their actual work. Knight careers were entirely dependent on maintaining the approval of people who were often emotionally unstable and who had never learned to evaluate professional performance objectively. Medieval knights describe feeling trapped in careers that required enormous personal and financial investment, but which provided no guarantee of long-term security or professional advancement. They were highly skilled specialists in a field where success was determined not by objective performance measures, but by the subjective satisfaction of clients who were often impossible to please. The retirement planning for knights was particularly complex because most knights couldn't accumulate enough personal wealth to support themselves independently, and they were often too psychologically damaged by their careers to transition successfully to other types of work. Medieval knight careers often ended with former knights becoming dependent on the charity of their former employers or their families. The economic records reveal that many knights suffered from what we would now recognize as career-related psychological disorders: depression, anxiety, and social Dysfunction caused by spending their entire adult lives managing other people's problems while having no control over their own career trajectories or personal relationships. Medieval letters between knights reveal constant financial anxiety and career insecurity, combined with resentment toward people who were wealthy, enough to pay for knight services, but who often treated knights as expensive, replaceable servants rather than skilled professionals. Knights describe feeling economically trapped in careers that were essential to society, but which provided little personal satisfaction or financial security. The tax implications of knight income were also complex, because knights received compensation in multiple forms: land, property, direct payments, and various services and benefits, and they were often responsible for managing complex financial arrangements that involved multiple noble families and political jurisdictions. Knights found themselves serving as informal financial advisors and accountants for their own careers, managing investment strategies and tax obligations that were complicated by the political and diplomatic aspects of their work. They needed to understand not just their own financial situations, but also the economic and political relationships between the families they served. But despite all these economic challenges and psychological difficulties, knights continued to work in the profession because medieval society literally couldn't function without them. The services they provided were so essential to social stability that noble families were willing to pay almost any price to ensure that qualified child management specialists were available. And that brings us to the ultimate irony of medieval knight careers. These people were simultaneously the most respected and the most psychologically damaged. Members of medieval society and their professional success came at enormous personal cost that was rarely acknowledged by the families and communities they served. So here we are at the end of this historical reality check. And if you're anything like most people, you're probably sitting there wondering how we got medieval knights so completely wrong. How did a profession that was essentially advanced childcare with swords become the stuff of romantic legends and heroic fantasies? The answer tells us as much about ourselves as it does about medieval society. The transformation of knights from professional child wranglers into romantic heroes happened gradually over centuries, but it was driven by some very human psychological needs. Medieval society itself began the myth-making process because nobody wanted to acknowledge that their most respected warriors were actually spending their time changing diapers and mediating food fights. It was much more psychologically satisfying to imagine that these expensive specialists were noble warriors dedicated to honor and glory. The families who employed knights had enormous incentives to romanticize what knights actually did, because the reality was embarrassing for everyone involved. No medieval lord wanted to admit that he was paying premium wages to armed babysitters because his children were so difficult to manage that they required professional intervention. It was much better to describe knights as military advisors and protectors, even when everyone knew that the primary threats to noble families came from their own children's behavioral problems. The knights themselves participated in this myth-making because the alternative was acknowledging that they had dedicated their entire adult lives to a profession that was essentially impossible and psychologically devastating. It was easier to write poetry about noble quests and military honor than to write honestly about the daily reality of managing people who treated them like expensive servants while having the power to destroy their careers or their lives on a whim. But the most important factor in creating the knight mythology was that medieval society genuinely needed heroes, and knights were the closest thing they had to people who made heroic sacrifices for the greater good. The fact that those sacrifices involved managing difficult children rather than fighting dragons didn't make them less real or less important. Think about what knights actually accomplished. They prevented wars by managing the psychological problems of people who had the power to start international conflicts over personal disputes. They maintained social stability by providing professional management for individuals whose behavioral problems could destabilize entire regions. They preserved political alliances by serving as diplomatic mediators and crisis counselors for families whose children's romantic and social disasters could affect multiple generations. Medieval society would have collapsed without knights, not because of external military threats, but because of internal social dysfunction caused by wealthy people who had never learned normal behavioral and social skills. Knights provided services that were absolutely essential to civilization, even though those services were completely different from what we imagine when we think about medieval warfare and chivalry. The modern romanticization of knights serves similar psychological functions to the medieval myth-making. We want to believe in noble warriors who dedicate their lives to honor and service, because that gives us hope that such people exist and that civilization is protected by individuals who are willing to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. But here's the really interesting part. When you understand what knights actually did, their real accomplishments are much more impressive than the mythological versions. Managing difficult, powerful people without using violence or coercion requires skills that are far more sophisticated than military combat. Providing effective behavioral therapy and crisis counseling under dangerous conditions requires courage that's much more complex than physical bravery in battle. Medieval knights were essentially social workers, teachers, counselors, and crisis managers who worked with the most challenging client population in human history: wealthy, powerful people with severe behavioral problems and no motivation to change. The fact that they managed to maintain social stability while working under these conditions represents one of the most remarkable professional achievements in human history. Modern professionals who work in similar fields, child psychologists, social workers, crisis counselors, diplomatic negotiators, might actually have more in common with medieval knights than modern military personnel do. The skills required for managing difficult people, preventing social disasters, and maintaining functional relationships under stressful conditions are essentially the same whether you're working in a medieval castle or a modern therapeutic institution. The economic model of knight services also has modern parallels that are worth considering. Medieval nobles paid premium prices for specialized child management services because they understood that their children's behavioral problems could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate families. Modern wealthy families often make similar investments in private schools, therapeutic programs, and specialized educational services for the same basic reasons. The psychological toll that knight careers took on the people who chose them is also remarkably similar to what we see in modern helping professions. Burnout, career-related depression, and social isolation are common problems among people who dedicate their lives to managing other people's psychological and behavioral problems, whether they're working in medieval castles or modern therapeutic institutions. But perhaps the most important lesson from the real history of medieval knights is that heroism often looks completely different from what we expect. The people who make the most important contributions to social stability and human welfare aren't necessarily the ones who get recognized in popular culture or historical narratives. Medieval knights made enormous personal sacrifices to provide services that were essential to civilization, but those services were so unglamorous and psychologically complex that they've been almost completely erased from popular historical memory. The real heroes of medieval society were people who were willing to dedicate their entire adult lives to managing other people's children, knowing that their work would be difficult, dangerous, and largely unappreciated. And that raises some interesting questions about our own society. Who are the modern people providing essential services that are difficult, dangerous, and largely unappreciated? Who are the contemporary professionals making personal sacrifices to manage problems that could affect entire communities if they weren't properly handled? Teachers, social workers, crisis counselors, mental health professionals, emergency responders. These are the people who serve functions in modern society that are similar to what medieval knights actually did. They work with difficult populations under challenging conditions, they prevent social disasters through professional intervention, and they maintain community stability by providing specialized services that most people don't understand or appreciate. Maybe the real lesson from the medieval knight story is that we should be more honest about recognizing and supporting the people who actually do the essential work of maintaining civilization, rather than creating romantic fantasies about heroism that ignore the complex, unglamorous reality of what effective social service actually requires. Medieval knights were essentially professional problem solvers who worked with the most challenging cases in their society, using specialized skills to prevent individual behavioral problems from escalating into community disasters. That's not a romantic story, but it's a much more important and impressive accomplishment than anything you'll see in a Hollywood movie about knights. So the next time you see a movie or read a story about noble knights on romantic quests, remember that the real medieval knights were probably much more heroic than their fictional counterparts. They just showed their heroism by changing diapers, mediating food fights, and preventing international wars through advanced childcare management techniques. And honestly, that's way more impressive than fighting dragons. If you made it this far through this deep dive into the absurd reality of medieval knights, you're probably the kind of person who appreciates having your historical assumptions completely destroyed by ridiculous facts. Hit that like button if this changed how you think about medieval history. And subscribe because we're going to keep exploring the gap between historical mythology and historical reality. I'm always curious about our global community of history lovers, so drop a comment with where you're listening from and what historical myth you'd like us to demolish next. Did you have any idea that knights were basically armed babysitters? What's the most surprising thing you learned about the actual day-to-day reality of medieval knighthood? And if you enjoyed this journey into the world's most overqualified childcare professionals, you might want to check out our next video about why medieval doctors were basically just really expensive fortune tellers with a disturbing obsession with bodily fluids. Trust me, once you understand what medieval medicine actually involved, you'll never complain about modern healthcare again. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the ridiculous reality of medieval knights. Now go forth with the knowledge that some of history's most respected warriors spent most of their time trying to convince teenagers to eat their vegetables and stop stabbing each other during family dinners. You're welcome.